Hello, welcome back to my channel. Northstar here. I'll start right off with a short article. Czechoslovakia, turning ahead, Friday, March 22nd, 1968. Don't lie to us, they shouted. Answer the questions. Packed into a Prague ballroom for a rally of the Communist Youth League, the audience was in a belligerent mood. For more than 5 hours, about 2,000 people grilled leading communist officials and writers who didn't stamp their feet when the responses were not to their liking. At 66 district party meetings across Czechoslovakia, other comrades hissed the speakers, clamored to be heard, and demanded to know the names of those who had opposed reforms within the party. Throughout the country last week, the tides of liberalization turned ahead with torrential force. Most of the criticism was aimed at Antonin Novotny, 63, lost his job as the party boss to Alexander Dubcek in January, but is still Czechoslovakia's president. A brief word here, though, before I get further. The tides of, quote, liberalization. Liberalization can refer to neoliberalism. It can refer to loosening laws or restrictions, or it can refer to a move towards capitalism in a socialist context. Just keep that in mind. They have different meanings depending on the context. Dubcek supporters believe they will not be able to carry out all the reforms they want, especially in the stagnant economy, until Novotny and his approaching cronies are uprooted from the government. And of course, keep in mind, time, a biased source if there ever was one, strongly anti-communist like any U.S. Media outlet, but proceeding with a certain blindness here. There's the claim that, it was in the communist regimes, people had no voice, they couldn't say anything, they couldn't speak up, but don't lie to us, answer the questions, people are stamping and hooting. That's not the system that was often sold to the US public about supposedly being somewhere where you couldn't say anything against those in power, because that was always a lie. People may not have always held as much power as they should have, but they did often have the ability to speak up and make their discontent known. We're talking in the 60s. We're not talking the Soviet Union under Stalin, but after de-Stalinization for sure. Other Czechoslovaks simply wanted to banish the remaining vestiges of what had been a humorless and at times brutal regime. Those who have lost the trust of the people, says Professor Oda Sik, author of the economic reforms that Novotny opposed, must be driven from positions of trust. Right. Just keep one other thing in mind. The CIA had heavy infiltration into the Warsaw Pact and often had people who were working to undermine things. Anyways, she provides no evidence that they've lost the trust of the people, just takes it as a given and then says they must be driven out. Anyways, the Novotnyites quickly got the point. When some tried to resign, their subordinates demanded that they be fired instead. That was the fate of Miroslav Pestrik, chief of the Council of Trade Unions, and Michael Chudik, president of the Slovak National Council. Czechoslovakia, of course, was a country of two ethnic culture groups, the Czechs and the Slovaks. So this guy was in charge of the Slovak National Council, the group that was most often oppressed by Czechs. Other apartchikai, like Prague party boss Marin Bakulik, reduced themselves to apologetic jelly, went on TV to profess support of Dubcek and deny past errors. Supposedly this is the liberalized guy, but people are reduced to apologetic jelly. Often they're being threatened. Deputy Defense Minister, like Dubcek is supposed to, he's so gentle, and no. Dubcek Defense Minister Vladimir Janko, 50, made a particularly dramatic departure, accused of having had a role in trying to organize a coup on Novotny's behalf last January. Janko shot himself to death in the backseat of his chauffeured Tatra while on the way to answer the charges before the Czechoslovak cabinet. Shot himself to death or was murdered. In an effort to save his own scalp, Novotny himself was forced to fire 2 of his most loyal men, Interior Minister Joseph Kurdna and State Attorney General Jan Bartuska. The cabinet linked both men to the army coup attempt and further accused them of blocking efforts to clear the names of persons wrongly imprisoned or executed in the past. Of course, what's defined as wrongly is often defined based on who's currently in power. Extraordinary events. As the country's leaders continue to examine their own consciences, some extraordinary events were occurring. Consciences, or, again, biased source here, time. In the Cold War, the Czechoslovak Supreme Court decided to review all cases heard in the 1950s in a search for those who may have been falsely accused and unjustly convicted. After 5 days of meetings, reported the newspaper Rude Pravo, party watchdogs in the foreign ministry demanded that the foreign policy of Czechoslovakia have a new face, i.e. a pro-Western face. Strangest of all, the party censors in the Interior Ministry announced that they wanted to go out of business. We have reached the conclusion, they said, that preventive political censorship be abolished at the present state of development. Really? The mood of the people was euphoric and solemn. More than 3,000 workers and students trekked in dry... Because, keep in mind, there's censorship in the United States all over the West. We pretend there isn't, but, Trump forces TikTok to be sold to one of his cronies and then silences anyone who criticizes his regime. And this is not unusual. The U.S. government usually does it with more of a velvet glove, but censorship is nothing if not the norm in the West. And Czechoslovakia has the U.S. constantly trying to push into the capitalist camp during the Cold War. The mood of the people was euphoric and solemn. More than 3,000 workers and students trekked in driving snow to the village of Lany outside Prague to visit the grave of ex-foreign minister Jack Masaryk, who jumped or was pushed from window to his death in 1948. Don't know much about who that guy was or what he stood for. The communists, who have worked ceaselessly to obliterate the democratic patriots' memory. They always love to say democratic, i.e. capitalist, most likely. Usually, it's democratic if it's capitalist, even if you literally support far-right dictators in some cases. You should see some of the Time reporting on the Indonesian genocide. Oh, they're democratic when they're murdering 1 million people. But kept crowds away from the grave for years. While a girl student played a folk melody on a flute, a bearded youth read a eulogy that urged Czechoslovaks to remember Masaryk in these crucial times when we hope that men of his quality lead our nation. Last perch. Dubcek's men warned the people against going too far, too fast with liberalization, perhaps mindful of the 20 Russian divisions poised across the border in eastern Germany. Even the most outspoken reformers stopped short of suggesting a break with the Soviet Union. The press did, however, give surprisingly frank coverage of last week's riots in Poland, which were partly sparked by the events in Czechoslovakia. Spreading instability. At week's end, Dubcek announced the party Central Committee we gather next week to discuss more personnel changes. As for Novotny, he continued to tour factories, where he no doubt tried to win worker support by predicting unemployment, inflation, and other hardship from Dubcek's reforms. Moving towards capitalism, quite likely actually, since capitalism usually has lots of unemployment, and liberalization, even a workers' cooperative system. History proved them right, with Gorbachev's economic reforms leading to widespread unemployment in the Soviet Union when they never had any before. It seemed, however, that the party was about to nudge Novotny off his last perch in the government. Already, 3 men were mentioned to succeed him as president. Minister of Forestry, Joseph Smarkovsky, General Ludovic Svoboda turned out to be a fascist sympathizer, if I remember correctly. Or maybe I'm mixing him up with a different guy with the same last name. I think there was a Ukrainian by that name. The parts of Czechoslovakia bordered western Ukraine. And Deputy Prime Minister Oldrich Cernik could have been one of his descendants, of course. Based on the age, that's probably like his child or grandchild. 46. Are liberals of the Dubcek stripe. Right. Give me 1 sec, because there's something I need to read off here, too, that I forgot to have right next to me. 1 moment. Sorry, and back. Now I'm going to mention, by the way, on the tone of censorship, Dubcek tried to do austerity programs, which when you Google anything about this, there's attempts to censor and hide facts that are not convenient to the U.S. empire, the CIA version of events. Although ironically, some of the most critical stuff I've found has come from CIA government websites themselves, usually Freedom of Information Act requests that were put in before Reagan undermined those. A lot of stuff, CIA was forced to make public, which they probably hate that they were forced to make public, but putting the lie to a lot of things they say anyways. But when you search Dubcek cut welfare programs, you get nothing, and AI will say he didn't do that. All you have to do is change the wording slightly, right? Put stuff in about Dubcek and austerity, and you'll get the AI summary we'll talk about, which I don't want a bloody AI summary, but of course they'll talk about him and implementing austerity, and then it'll actually have links you can click on to go to stuff about it. So yeah, the AI outright lies to you unless you word things very carefully. I mean, this is going to be a problem. Apparently in China, there's also AIs that will gloss over certain things the regime, the government there doesn't want people to know about. So it happens all over the world, but the U.S. loves to pretend that it doesn't do such things. By what you see, there are 2 CIA articles here, Freedom of Information Act stuff that puts a lie to a lot of what they said about the Czech Spring. Anyways, in April, Dubcek launched an action program of liberalizations, which included freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and freedom of movement, with economic emphasis on consumer goods and the possibility of multi-party government. The program was based on the view that socialism cannot mean only liberation of the working people from the domination of exploiting class relations, but must make more provisions for a fuller life of the personality than any bourgeois democracy. Of life of the personality, you're already seeing liberal ideas here, as in capitalist ideas and phrasings of things. Which it's not a large jump from that to saying, oh, we must have capitalism so the leading personalities can be rewarded ritually. It would limit the power of the secret police and provide for the federalization of the CSSR into 2 equal nations. So basically breaking Czechoslovakia into Czech and Slovak republics, though the Soviets would end up doing that anyways, meeting this demand after ending the Prague Spring. The program also covered foreign policy, including both the maintenance of good relations with Western countries and cooperation with the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc nations. You can't have both sides. There was another CIA article about how it was, I don't think it was in this one, or this one actually, but there's some mention of it here as well, about he's trying to play both sides, the Soviets and the United States. But of course, that's not really possible. You end up having to choose an end. It spoke of a 10-year transition. At least not possible countries are already on one side of the fence or the other. Some countries like Finland and Sweden were able to play both sides against each other, by Sweden in particular, by remaining neutral the whole time. Finland was actually more pro-Soviet, but it did sometimes play the US and Soviets against each other, but that's by having never been fully in the Soviet camp to begin with. Spoke of a 10-year transition through which democratic elections would be made possible and a new form of social democracy. Social democracy is capitalism with generous welfare systems, except Dubcek was cutting welfare programs, so that's a lie. And democratic socialism, i.e. he's going to legalize capitalist parties and then probably they're just going to happen to win elections, would replace the status quo. Those who drafted the action program were careful not to criticize the actions of the post-war communist administration, or to point out the policies that they felt had outlived their usefulness. For instance, the immediate post-war situation required centralist and directive administrative methods to fight against the remains of the bourgeois. Since the antagonistic that is to eliminate the billionaires is the idea. Since the antagonistic classes were said to have been defeated in Czechoslovakia maybe, but certainly not in the West, and they're always looking to expand and to bring back capitalism in Eastern Europe, which they did then the Cold War. Even when people did not vote for capitalism, did not go out into the streets demanding it. That's a lie that's been told. I'll get to something on that in a second. That's what I was describing, because I had something I wanted to read off from a book. These methods were no longer necessary. Reform was needed for the Czechoslovak economy to join the scientific, technical revolution of the world. This is assuming that somehow socialism is not scientifically advanced, even though it put the first man in space. That capitalism is more advanced, which is a lie, other than that the U.S. is more advanced, not because it was capitalist, but because it kept the Soviet Union isolated from world trade, which is not inherently a capitalist thing, world trade. Rather than rely on Stalinist era heavy industry, labor power, and raw materials. This is a misrepresentation. In fact, a bogeyman. Oh, Stalin just built heavy industry everywhere. Actually, the Stalinist era built a lot of educational institutions, scientific laboratories all over. I mean, a lot of, I guess you could call it raw labor power being put into scientific endeavors in terms of massively increasing the number of scientists in the country, but not at all how what this was falsely claiming. This LO really should say the full name of the piece instead of just last name. Makes it hard to track stuff down. That's intentional on Wikipedia, I swear, sometimes. Anyways, furthermore, since internal class conflict had been overcome, which was always looking to come back, like Palpatine in Star Wars, workers could now be duly rewarded for their qualifications and technical skills without contravening Marxist-Leninism. Except they were duly rewarded. Scientists and engineers are paid much more highly than the rest of the population. At least in the Soviet Union itself. I doubt that was any less true in Czechoslovakia. The program suggests it was now necessary to ensure important positions were, quote, filled by capable, educated, socialist expert cadres in order to compete with capitalism. That could be considered a... Shoot, the guy who... if you've watched my Crisis in the Kremlin Let's Play series, the guy who is a rival of Khrushchev, who is actually more like closer to Stalin than Khrushchev was, and wanted to make sure that experts were in positions of power. That could be considered an echo of that stance, and in that way, and then if so, not really so much as a return to an idea that had been defeated before by power. Doesn't mean that it was the wrong idea. Just because something loses doesn't mean it's wrong, or just because something wins doesn't mean it's right. Like if you enforce your ideology at the point of a gun or through economic warfare, doesn't mean you were correct. People need to learn about the Soviet Union, actually, and socialism, communism. Although it was stipulated that reform must proceed under KSC direction, popular pressure mounted to implement reforms immediately. Radical elements became more vocal. Anti-Soviet polemics appear in the press. On June 26, 1968, there's always this idea that the press was never critical, but that's not true. It was even less true under Dubcek. Social Democrats began to form a separate party. Again, capitalists. They can say that they weren't a think tank. Progressive alliance of socialists and Democrats, your parliamentary group today. But yeah, they were capitalists. Began to form a separate party. New unaffiliated political clubs were created. Party conservatives urged repressive measures, but Dubcek counseled moderation and re-emphasized KSC leadership. At the Presidium of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia in April, Dubcek announced a political program of socialism with the human face. In May, he announced that the 14th Party Congress would convene in an early session on 9th September. The Congress would incorporate the action program into the party's statutes, draft a federalization law, and elect a new central committee. Dubcek's reforms guaranteed freedom of the press and political commentaries allowed for the first time in mainstream media, except that's not really fully accurate. But this is Wikipedia after all. At the time of the Prague Spring, Czechoslovak exports were declining competitiveness. Exports, not experts. And Dubcek's reforms plan, well, because paying people less than $2 a day will always be more competitive, lead to lower price on the international markets. The U.S. setting up sweatshops all over Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia and such at this time period. I think, this would be during the Vietnam War. So U.S. had a military dictatorship in South Vietnam. All these And of course, Indonesia and Thailand, where far-right governments put in power by the CIA were ruling. This was after the Indonesian genocide. Anyways, so yeah, you're not going to compete with that kind of exploitation and mass murder in international markets. Dubcek's reforms plan to solve these troubles by mixing planned and market economies, i.e. putting in just a little capitalism. Oh, it'll be fine. Just a little poison. Within the party, there were varying opinions on how this should proceed. Certain economists wished for a more mixed economy, mix of capitalism and socialism, while others wanted the economy to remain mostly planned. Dubcek continued to stress the importance of economic reform proceeding under Communist Party rule. Oda Sikh, who was the man behind the economic reform, saw his economic views as third way ones. Right. And the third way is a predominantly centrist political system that attempts to reconcile center-right and center-left policies. Bill Clinton is the way. I'm not sure that's entirely accurate, but if it is, that would just be deeply capitalist nonsense. Probably just linking the wrong thing. On June 27th, Ludwig Vakulik, leading author and journalist, published a manifesto titled The 2,000 Words, expressed concern about conservative elements within the KSC and so-called foreign forces. Oh yes, anything that's hardline must be foreign. Vakulik, this is a tool of nationalists everywhere, calling the people to take the initiative in implementing the reform program. Dubcek, the party presidium, the National Front, and the cabinet denounced this manifesto. All right, enough of that. Let's get to a little bit of the evidence of the lies, starting with this CIA document, the Freedom of Information Act, 2000, June 13th, 2000. So, Freedom of Information Act was created before Reagan. Reagan cut its heart out. Then there was an attempt to revive it. So right around the end of the Clinton years, this Freedom of Information Act was strengthened again. For a brief 2 or 3 year period, there was a lot more FOIA requests that were being approved. And then Bush Jr., in power, 9/11, Patriot Act, using that as an excuse to make it hard to get Freedom of Information Act approved, make it easy to just censor everything and the release of information. Yes, censorship when you black everything out. We don't like to say the U.S. does censorship, but we absolutely do, including censorship of what the public is even allowed to know about the government's been up to. But this is something that the government would have opposed, but were legally required to disclose before Bush Jr. used September 11th as an excuse to make it so he didn't have to disclose stuff like this anymore. Also, the CIA briefly had more progressive elements in it until 9/11, so they were less opposed in the past. Washington, the Central Intelligence Agency, has secretly claimed a large share of credit for the rise of the liberal and ill-fated Dubcek regime in Czechoslovakia in 1938. The specific claim is that Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, 2 CIA broadcasting stations in West Germany, the FOIA certainly isn't mincing words in this, could just be a copy of a newspaper thing, but it certainly cuts the point of things. And why would it be FOIA if it was this newspaper? It's probably an internal government publication. There are these circulars that exist. Were instrumental in provoking the ouster of Antonin Novotny, a pro-Soviet Stalinist, as head of the Czech Communist Party. So, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, CIA mouthpieces spread endless lies and propaganda into the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Alexander Dubcek replaced Novotny in January 1968 and established a major program of liberation. It certainly is not unbiased, even if it's frank, that led to the Soviet invasion the following August. Justifying the invasion, Moscow alleged that members of the Dubcek regime were plotting with Western agents to upset the communist system in Czechoslovakia. But Senate sources who have investigated the activities of RFE and RL discounted any parallel to the Hungarian uprisings in 1956, when RFE was accused of encouraging the insurgents to expect the United States to intervene militarily against the Russians. This is basically admitting that the Hungarian uprisings actually did have CIA backing without saying it as openly. A close check of subsequent transmissions, one source said, showed that the 2 stations have scrupulously avoided any statements implying the United States might come to the aid of liberal anti-Soviet regimes in Eastern Europe. Doesn't mean that they weren't working for Western agents. It's not just a matter of Radio Free Europe. The fate of RFE and RL in the hands of Radio Free Europe and, to be clear, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, in the hands of a Senate House Conference Committee debating how to shift their operations from the CIA to above-board government control. Is in the hands, sorry. Emergency financing for the stations ends today, but enough CIA funds are thought to be on hand to keep them going until Congress finally makes up its mind. The CIA's role in events in Czechoslovakia came to light in a confidential report by the Council on Foreign Relations that's been obtained by the Chicago Sun-Times. The report contains a digest of a discussion between several former high-ranking CIA officials 3 days after Dubcek replaced Novotny. Among those taking part were the late Alan Dulles, absolute psychopath, first director of the CIA, and Richard Bissell, former deputy director for plans, clandestine operations. During the discussion, one of the participants, obviously relying upon CIA information, declared a couple of much criticized public media projects, cited by name, had proven of value as the fall of Novotny in Czechoslovakia suggested. So implying that they helped create this through spreading propaganda into Czechoslovakia. Other reliable intelligence sources confirmed that the censored projects cited were Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. Just the radio stations. The sources said the two stations successfully disparaged Novotny as an antiquated Stalinist and played up the possibility of reform through utopian socialism. Utopian socialism as opposed to scientific socialism, but this wouldn't even be considered utopian socialism, because utopian socialism is about how you achieve socialism in the first place, which they already had in Czechoslovakia. It's about whether the billionaires would just hand over power or you have to take it from them. So this is misusing terms. But, all right. I'll get to the CIA memorandum in a second, and then a New York Times article. First, though, a little piece from a book. This is from If We Burn. On West Germany, one of the richest countries in human history, to spend 2 trillion euros to integrate them and expand state structures. This is about East Germany could rely on West Germany just integrate them. Much of the rest of the post-communist population got war or devastating poverty instead. In the first 3 years of the 1990s, violence broke out in Croatia, Chechnya, Moldova, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Tajikistan, Armenia, and Bosnia. These were all Soviet, or in the case of Croatia and Bosnia, former Yugoslavian, all communist countries that when capitalism came, violence came in enormous quantities, killing hundreds of thousands of people. There are going to be economic problems no matter what happened, but the leaders in Moscow, encouraged by Washington, embarked upon economic shock therapy. After elected lawmakers tried to stop him, President Boris Yeltsin, a close ally of Washington, that's actually an understatement. Some of the open statements of support from Bill Clinton, if I remember correctly, Bush Sr. as well, right before he left office, towards Yeltsin. Oh, it's just, he was outright a U.S. puppet. Anyways, Boris Yeltsin, a close ally of Washington, illegally dissolved the Russian legislature and then sent tanks to shell the Parliament building, the Russian White House, which was shelled, i.e., the tanks just opened fire and basically blew up large parts of, it'd be like if the U.S. Congress building was shelled by, M1 Abrams or something when they tried to, impeach Trump or something like that. That would be the equivalent of what happened. And this is what we proclaimed was democracy. And then sent tanks to shell the Parliament building. Russian elites rapidly privatized Soviet assets and removed controls on prices. This was the capitalist version of under the stones, the beach. Once the command I'm not going to go into that, it's a French saying. Once the command economy had been shot to death, functioning markets would simply grow from the rubble. This did not happen. Instead, Russia experienced a more severe rise in mortality than ever been seen during peacetime in a modern society. Let me emphasize, ever. Almost everywhere it was tried, shock therapy led to a deep and long recession, along with huge drops in indicators for education, poverty, and health. By 1995, 45% of people in 18 post-communist countries studied by the World Bank were living under the poverty line of $4 a day. And the poverty hit children especially hard. Before the transition, to capitalism from socialism, the poverty rate was 4%. As late as 2015, the average real income of 99% of Russians was lower than it had been in 1991. 2015 to 1991, 99% of people were making less money than under socialism. Central Asia fared even worse. In countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, so all part of the Soviet Union, republics of the Soviet Union proper during the Cold War, the poverty rates jumped higher than 60%. The collapse of the Soviet economic system vastly increased inequality and poverty, but it did not change who had the remaining assets. Those who stayed with the former nomenclatura, i.e. the appurchik, different terms, you've already seen this discussed before, and their cronies, those who stayed with the former nomenclatura, and their cronies, who quickly became a new class, now called oligarchs. That's where we get the oligarchs like Putin in Russia and the former Soviet countries today. The name given to the process that emerged in the 1990s, by which the entire world seemed to be integrating into a single capital system, was globalization. Harvard historian Odd Arn Vestad has claimed that a better name for what really happened is Americanization. The United States has succeeded in shaping a global economic system and establishing itself as hegemon. That is dominant hegemon, that the big boss, that the leader of a bunch of vassal states, basically. Americanization could be felt in the political economic sphere as well as the cultural. And then we get stuff about the influence of U.S. media, but that's keep in mind the people that we said, oh, they stole all the resources and all the money under socialism, the party bosses. Now, they stole all the assets when capitalism came about, and they became much, much wealthier. It's not that economic production increased, because it didn't. It actually decreased. Its inequality increased. There is a difference of scale between what was siphoned off by the elites under socialism and the much larger amounts siphoned off under capitalism. Anyways, CIA Special Memorandum, Czechoslovakia, the Dubcek Pause. Secret, June 13, 1968. Proof for release, June 29th, 2005. CIA Office of National Estimates. This is much larger. I looked at a few key pieces of this, but I'm not going to be able to get through such a long thing entirely. It's worth noting. The related crises in internal Czechoslovak politics and in the Soviet Czechoslovak relations seem to have eased, at least at home, into a delicate and perhaps temporary domestic equilibrium, and abroad into an uneasy truce with Moscow. The regime of party leader Dubcek and Premier Cernak has, in effect, promised that it will control the pace of domestic reform. Moscow has gained the appearance of Czech compliance, but Prague seems at the same time to have been able to preserve the essential substance of its democratic experiment. This is before Soviets intervened, proving the CIA didn't even know what was up half the time. This memorandum was produced solely by the CIA. And democratic. The CIA often drank their own Kool-Aid. It's always democratic if it moves towards capitalism, and even if it leads to military dictatorship. Nonsense. Democracy only for the billionaires. Brutal austerity and oppression for everyone else. The compromise seems to come about sequentially as a result of strong Soviet pressures, or, oligarchy. Like, Putin is not in charge of a democracy. And it was not a move towards democracy. People like Putin taking over control of Russia. It was a move away from it. The Soviet Union was more democratic than Putin's Russia. Anyways, the compromise seems to come about sequentially as a result of strong Soviet pressures, rising Czech concern, mildly concessionary Czech responses, and finally the Soviets' own anxiety to find some way to avoid direct military intervention, which ended up having to do in the end. It is true, nonetheless, that if quiescence has been restored to the relationship. Quiescence is a term often used in biology. It can mean sleep or inactivity, is by no means assured indefinitely. An undetermined number of Soviets are currently engaged in Warsaw Pact exercise on Czech soil. The present serves at a minimum as an ominous reminder to the Dubcek regime of Soviet power and of the Soviet Union's continuing interest in Czech developments. The recently concluded plenum of the Czechoslovak Central Committee was reassuring to the Soviets in some respects, but not at all in others. Dubcek, in fact, is working both sides of the street. He is trying to buy off Moscow with promises of continued communist authority in Czechoslovakia and unswerving Czech loyalty to the Warsaw Pact. At the same time, he is seeking to strengthen his domestic position by pledging at least the gradual growth of democracy at home and independence abroad. Right. Democracy, but with some people may have thought they were going to get democratic socialism and still have socialist government, but others would have understood this as coded for capitalism. Prague's concessions, domestic and foreign. And this wasn't just people coming to this desire on their own. Of course, I already read the thing about Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe pumping propaganda in the CIA, internally acknowledging that that was the reason that Dubcek came to power. So Western propaganda leads to people wanting something, and then we act as if it's just the people's own desire. Prague's concessions, domestic and foreign. Prague yielded to the Soviets on two major foreign policy issues and on several domestic issues of great concern to the Soviet Union. First, concerning policy towards Germany, the Czechs evidently discarded the possibility of an early move towards diplomatic recognition of West Germany. In addition, that's the, U.S. puppet state Germany, with East Germany maybe being the Soviet puppet state. In addition, they reversed the recent public opposition to East Germany's claims on the Berlin Axis question, began to mute their bitter open quarrel with the Ulbricht regime. Ulbricht was Walter Ulbricht, a German communist, not some people like, oh, he's just a Soviet puppet. No, he was a committed German communist who was trying to bring about communism in Germany before the Nazis took power. And he saw his opportunity at the end of World War II and worked with the Soviets to create a actually fairly committed East German communist faction, if you will, within the government. There were many sincere communists in East Germany. Anyways, recent East German moves affecting West German axis, just as there are many fascists who literally stayed on from the Nazi regime in West Germany. The U.S. did not remove judges who were appointed by the Nazis from power, for instance, and many mayors and local officials that just continued to hold in the power. Same people have been put in by the Nazis. So, committed fascists in West Germany and committed communists in East Germany, and despite them both being puppet states. Anyways, recent East German moves affecting West German access to West Berlin may cause the Czechs some considerable anxiety. A crisis over Berlin would perhaps give the Soviets a pretext for insisting that the troops in Czechoslovakia remain there at least for the duration. A pretext or a valid reason? Some Soviet military figures apparently brought up the subject of stationing other Warsaw Pact forces in Czechoslovakia last month. The Czechs, of course, refused. But in the event of renewed trouble over Berlin, attended by strident Soviet propaganda against West German fascists and revanchists, there were definitely fascists. I don't know about revanchists, in fact. There's not really any evidence for that, but there were definitely fascists in power there. And in East Germany, a lot of fascists escaped Soviet attempts to remove them from power too. Let's be clear, there were fascists in both Germanys. Prague might find it difficult to demand the removal of the Pact troops already present on Czech soil. In any case, as a second concession to the Soviets, the Czechs had already reaffirmed their military commitment to the Warsaw Pact. They did so both in word and deed, the latter by permitting the Pact exercises now underway. This, of course, was of crucial importance to Moscow. The political significance of Pact membership is obvious. In Czechoslovakia's case, there is in the Soviet view some considerable military significance as well. Geography aside, Czechoslovakia has contributed more manpower per capita to the forces of the Warsaw Pact than any other member state, even including the Soviet Union. And by and large, the Czechoslovak soldier is better equipped and better trained than all others except his Soviet counterpart. There have been several indications that all this might change. The Czechs might hold fewer training exercises, decrease their participation in joint Pact exercises, shorten conscription terms, lower overall troop strength, and sharply reduce their military budget. Continuing to supply the Warsaw Pact. Enough of this stuff. Let's briefly, this Times article, and then a little commentary. The spring sun is warming spirits in Prague this weekend after winter's gloom. Year 1973, so 4 years after the stuff that happened in 69. Sidewalk vendors of ice cream and flowers are back at their stands. Girls in short skirts and youths in long hair stroll in cheerful groups. Newlywed couples emerge at 15-minute intervals into the sunshine from the archway of the 14th century old town hall. It is 5 years since the Prague Spring. I guess this is some place where people like to meet up and kiss. It's 5 years since the Prague Spring, when Alexander Dubcek and his innovative followers stirred political excitement and tension with a short-lived venture in liberal Marxism. The liberal leaders, now berated as counter-revolutionary adventurers, are isolated meal jobs that languish in exile. They were quite possibly not counter-revolutionary adventurers, but they were misguided and would have almost certainly opened the doors to capitalism in Czechoslovakia, which would have been a bad thing. Those statistics and how poorly people fared when capitalism came to Eastern Europe and Central Europe were no indication. No mood for politics. For most Czechoslovaks, the spring of 1968 seems to recede into the country's melancholy history. People appear to be mainly preoccupied by escapist interests in food, cars, and weekend cottages. They are no mood for politics or polemics. Escapist, yeah. The New York Times always called it escapist. Whenever people were happy in the Soviet Union or Warsaw Pact, it was escapism. And whenever they were unhappy, it was legitimate concern about communism. They're a biased source, after all. If eating is an outlet for emotional stress, as the experts suggest, Czechoslovaks should be among the most relaxed people anywhere. According to a recent report, the average dietary intake of calories here now exceeds 3,200, among the highest in the world. Keep in mind, you only need 2,000 to 2,500, so people are growing fat. Of course, we claim, communism, no food. These days, you see internet trolls saying that. They were eating an extra 700 calories for physically active men. And for women, that's more like 50% more. Most women need like 2,000 to 1,100, men 2,500 calories. They're eating 3,200 a day. So Czechs are growing fat. Wherever one turns in Prague, and that's even more calories per person than the Soviet Union at this point in history, though they caught up to this number, I think it was by 76 or 78. There was a CIA report that showed that Soviets were consuming over 3,200 calories a person a little later, although it was a little less than 73. Wherever one turns in Prague, people seem to be eating. A taxi driver digs into a bag of raisins as he steers with one hand through traffic. A hotel elevator operator frequently disappears into a cloakroom for a bite or two between ascents. An office clerk removes a half-eaten sandwich from a desk drawer as a visitor turns away. Could it also be that they are working very hard and don't have much time for lunch breaks? One thing that is true about communism is people tend to work very long hours under it. Pedestrians crowd sidewalk stands for sizzling sausages. Laundromat customers pass the time at a snack bar. Of course, they got days off, but when people got a lot of vacation time, but when they were working hard. Anyways, for a seat for every 10, which is, of course, not the propaganda you hear about the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact, but it's true. The truth is not what you hear in propaganda. Prague has more than 1,400 restaurants. This is 73. And the Warsaw Pact has more than 1,400 restaurants, cafes, buffets, cafeterias, snack bars, beer halls, and wine cellars, providing a total of 125,000 seats, or roughly one for each 10 citizens. Country of 1.25 million? Is it really that small? Often there is no empty seat. The food is generally well cooked and politely served. For the frequent snacks during the day, there are open sandwiches and a rich variety of heavy pastries piled high with swirls of whipped cream. Food stores are filled with meats, fruits, and vegetables, as well as imported chocolates, wines, and delicacies in tins. Not the communism no food meme you see, and the empty shelves, the famous empty shelf pics from the end of the Soviet Union. That was when the system was in collapse. This is more what things were like in the 70s. Shelves piled high with meats, fruits, vegetables. In the 80s, things were somewhat harder because the collapse in the price of oil, the U.S. instigated by pressuring Middle Eastern countries to produce less oil than they less oil, more oil than was economically optimal. So to the point where they were losing money, and they would have made higher profits by producing less oil. And the U.S. also playing with its strategic reserves and other attempts to intentionally manipulate down the price of oil so that the Soviet Union's price that they could get for their oil exports would plummet. And then, of course, if they're bringing less money, they're going to try and shift costs to the Warsaw Pact countries. And basically, everyone had to tighten their belts in the 80s due to the oil price crisis, which the U.S. set off. But that was, economic sabotage by the West. That's not how socialism normally worked, or how it compared to capitalism normally. Shelves stacked high was actually the norm. There was usually plenty of food. It was more things like cars that were usually harder to come by. Some of the city's leading restaurants, although you'll see not in Czechoslovakia, which had a better car industry than much of the Warsaw Pact. Some of the city's leading restaurants have evocative names like At the Golden Deer or At the Green Frog, but most eating places announce their presence as directly as the American roadside diners with blunt neon signs, Eat. A Chinese restaurant is named just that, the Chinese restaurant. A Jewish restaurant in the old ghetto that follows the dietary laws is the kosher restaurant. Beer flows freely. Beer was subsidized in East Germany, and probably also in Czechoslovakia by the government. Large glasses of foamy draft beer accompany most meals in Prague and represent a solid portion of the daily calories. Beer consumption is up to 37 gallons a person a year, compared with 14 gallons in 1936, before World War II. Whew. So that's a lot of beer they're drinking. Since then, meat consumption has doubled, from 75 pounds a person that year to almost 160 pounds now. Sharp increases in the consumption of vegetables, fruits, and sugars have also been noted. Also, you're not going to get much accurate data after 36 because the Nazis took over Czechoslovakia, invaded, took it over, invaded without a shot fired, and hardly shot fired. And because under British pressure, the Czechoslovak government was pressured into conceding. The British wanted this to not lead to warfare because the British were not quite ready for a war with Germany at the time, but also they wanted Hitler to grow powerful and then invade the Soviet Union, something that some internal British documents show they were planning on. Anyways, sharp increases in consumption of vegetables, fruits, and sugars also been noticed, but 36 is the last year you can get really valid, accurate data since Nazis lied about food consumption in Czechoslovakia and tried to fudge the figures. But the rich pastries are a national problem, commented Karol Majer, director of catering services in Central Prague. We are trying to phase out the heavy chocolate and whipped cream pastries, and replace them with fruit-based pastries, but it is hard to overcome tradition. This is back when people thought that fat was the problem, was what was making people fat. I mean, calorie consumption, yes. But it turns out heavy whipped cream, well, there's a lot of sugar in it. I was going to say fat fills people up and they tend to consume fewer calories when they eat fatty foods. Sugar stimulates appetite. Sugar leads to increased caloric consumption. If you eat more calories than you burn, you end up fat. Gesturing to his ample girth, Mr. Mayer acknowledged that he was fond of sampling his own products. Cars also popular. After food, passenger cars are becoming the major diversion for Czechoslovaks. Increasing local production and imports. Imports were, by the way, coming partly from France, which French cars were doing very well until Richard Nixon crashed the Bretton Woods global banking system and the French economy ate it. Really only about a year after this story was published, in fact, not even a year, later in the same year. This was published in March of 1973. By October, the French economy had cratered because of Richard Nixon crashing the global banking system. And by crashing, unilaterally tearing it up and making the massive French foreign currency reserves useless, as well as manipulating exchange rates, so the French had a hard time selling their cars around the world. This was intentional, by the way. He was targeting France because France is looking to withdraw from NATO at the time under de Gaulle. De Gaulle was a fairly right-wing politician, so it was more like the Brexit kind of right-wing populism, but he wanted out of NATO. But beer flows. Fuel cars are popular. Anyways, after food, passenger cars become the major diversion. Increasing local production. Czechoslovak car industry was quite respectable. They had a long tradition of such. In fact, during World War II, they were diverted to making tanks. Increasing local production imports have raised the total of private cars in the country to 1.1 million, one for each 14 citizens. This is almost a tenfold increase since the middle 1950s. Because, Eastern Central Europe, a lot poorer, are going to be way behind the US and such. In contrast to storages in other Eastern European countries, which I mentioned before, some cars are available for immediate delivery. Among them are the Czechoslovak-built Skoda, decent cars, also Skoda Iron Works, where they would have been built, and the Soviet Moskvich. I think those ones were famed for their reliability, though they were not very nice cars. Credit sales have been introduced to stimulate purchases of these makes. Chugging along the streets, but the credit would be provided by ultimately central banks that were owned by the government, as opposed to, like in capitalist countries, central banks are essentially private institutions that work on behalf of private bankers. The profits of this lending things on credit would be going to the government budget, which would just be leading to lower taxes. So not as exploitative at all, because it would come back to the people. Anyways, chugging along, and the streams of newer cars are hundreds of antiques, mostly from the mid-1930s, somehow kept running by their owners through World War II and the period of austerity that followed. Then there are the weekend cottages. Perched along riverbanks and beside pine forests, these cottages become popular means of escape. Prices are so low and land terms so easy that ordinary workers manage to fit a cottage into their budgets. Yep, widespread. A lot of vacation time and spending time in cottages was a thing throughout the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, throughout much of the socialist world. Something that people absolutely can't afford unless they're wealthy throughout much of the world today. Heck, I'm at a family cottage or cabin, but I have very wealthy family members, relatives, even though I've grown up in a great deal of poverty. And yeah, no, this would be unimaginable. I'm sure someday, at least the family, and it's the first time I've been up here in many, many years. I'm here because a roommate wants to kill me because I was living in a very terrible apartment and disabled long COVID, and the government's fighting my Social Security in bad faith. So I was in a very low rent apartment, and I ended up with this violent psycho who wanted to kill me because of my cough. Anyways, and of course, the cough has not been adequately treated because of the very poor health care you get under Medicaid in the United States. When I had student health insurance, I was in grad school, I was trying to become a physician, special master's, getting straight A's, and I was going to make it. I had a specialist who was actually going to follow up and try and figure out what the cause of the cough is. Then the pandemic hit, they canceled non-essential appointments. By the time I was able to revisit this, it was under Medicaid, and then they're just doing a terrible job of not wanting to actually work it up then, because people don't get good health care under Medicaid, because capitalism and the austerity for everyone but the rich. Most of the cottages are prefabricated, Alpine-style structures costing from $2,500 to $6,000 or so. I mean, with inflation, that might be more like $12,000 or $15,000 today, but that's at the high end, but that's still very cheap. Local authorities grant 99-year possession of plots of land for a nominal annual rent of $10 or less. Still not that much money even by today's standards. The cottages are not taxed and can be sold, rented, or passed on to heirs. I mean, presumably it's being rented not as a primary residence. So it's more okay, but so generally speaking, you don't want hereditary property that you yourself, socialism is fine with personal property, but private property, that's starting to fudge the line a little. If you pass on the cottages to heirs and you're renting out and someone lives there full time, but these are probably just vacation homes. Land allocated for cottages must be unsuitable for I think this is supposed to say farming, or other purposes, which means most cottages are clustered on rough ground or on narrow river banks under steep slopes. The demand has far outrun the available land. This weekend, the first warm weather, cottage owners in the hills and forests around Prague were busy cleaning up, doing repairs, and digging gardens. They seemed to have little time or inclination for thoughts about politics, because things were going well. And, socialism was keeping some of its promises of people being reasonably well off at the time. This is before the economic crash that Nixon triggered with tearing up Bretton Woods, and before the oil price crash that was also triggered by the U.S. All right, well, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Take care. Well, no, I'm not going to go right to the end. A little commentary here. So, hope you all enjoyed this video. I have to say, while Dubcek may have been earnest in some of his reformist views, probably many of them, similar to Gorbachev, if he'd been able to just run rampant with them, it would have probably led to Czechoslovakia becoming capitalist, and maybe it would have turned out better with the Soviet Union still around if it didn't lead to a domino effect collapse, because the US would have realized if people did horrendously when capitalism came to Czechoslovakia, it would have scared the other communist countries, and people would have realized capitalism had nothing but pain in store for them. But it could have also led to the collapse of the system, and we all know, or you should know, that things went horrendously for most people after communism ended, and the US had no geopolitical interest anymore in cushioning the transition to capitalism for ordinary people. And then capitalism, of course, just slowly tightens the noose on people once it gets in power, regardless. Makes people poorer and poorer and poorer so that the rich can get wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. In the post-communist countries, it went straight to incredible inequality without the so-called capitalist golden age, is the curve of relative equality. Because the oligarchs stole everything that wasn't nailed down, and then they'll continue to grow richer. It's not like it's going to become more equal. Generally speaking, the trend is just going to become towards that getting even worse. And what we see in Russia with the huge inequality and such, that's what's in store for the United States someday. When you're looking at that, you're not looking in the past, you're looking into the future of capitalism. So, capitalism is a vile system, and Dubcek placed the Warsaw Pact in immense danger, even if he may have been well-meaning. Of course, the Soviets were too hardline, and they didn't handle the situation well, but it was important. They needed to win the Cold War. If they had won the Cold War, the world would be in a better place. Not a great place. The Soviet Union was the lesser of two evils compared to the United States, but the US was going and doing the Indonesian genocide in the 60s when Czechoslovakia happened. In fact, giving kill lists to the Indonesian government. It was doing the Guatemalan genocide not much later. I think that was early 70s, like 72. So before that follow-up article was written. I have to check. Actually, easy enough. I'm sure the AI won't try and erase this event yet. What year Guatemalan genocide? Now, if I start searching stuff about U.S. involvement, the initial articles would be lies that 1960. Huh. Okay, earlier than I thought. Yeah, but it went on for like 10 years. So, so this was after the Indonesian genocide, the Guatemalan genocide. The first Congo genocide was well underway, supported by the US, the CIA. The Bangladesh genocide, I believe, had already occurred by this point when Bangladesh declared independence from Pakistan. Pakistani army rolled into Bangladesh, murdered huge numbers of people. The US, the CIA, State Department all backed this. The Soviets put an arms embargo to try and stop arms and ammunition from reaching Bangladesh to continue, to end the genocide. The U.S. Navy went and shot at the Soviet ships, fired warning shots at Soviet ships, almost starting World War III, to continue a genocide. And of course, let's not forget, Israel-Palestine was still going on this whole time and moving closer and closer to genocide we see today. And let's see, what other horrible atrocities. The Cambodian genocide that the CIA initially backed, although it was too much even for the CIA and the US to turn on it. Vietnam, Agent Orange. The firebombing of whole cities in North Korea during the Korean War, which is a war that the US falsely claimed the North Koreans were the aggressors, but South Korea had been carrying out armed raids into North Korea and massacring communists in South Korea and refusing to allow free and fair peninsula-wide elections. The US was involved in that because the communists would have won free and fair peninsula-wide elections because the communists are massively popular as the liberators who had defeated the Japanese in Northern Korea. and had considerable support in South Korea as well. So they would have got 70, 80, 90% of the votes in the North and at least 30% in the South, and they would have won. So rather than allow communism via elections, the US kept a puppet regime that was a direct continuation of the Japanese colonial government from before World War II in power. Yeah, capitalism is evil. US is a vicious global empire that needs to come down, needs to collapse, and hopefully humanity can do better than just moving to another empire after this. Hopefully. Maybe something that's European-led, EU, but as long as capitalism is in charge, things are just going to get worse. All right, well, I wish you all the best, viewers. Take care of each other, be kind to yourselves, and may you always find a guiding star lead you home. Until next time, it's Northstar. Adieu, and best luck to you all.